We're live, and we're only 10 minutes later than the few people who are currently in the YouTube chat expected us to be here. So, hello, those of you in the YouTube chat. Hello, friends in the Discord call. We are going to continue reading Benjamin Studebaker's fantastic work, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. This will be the third session that we're doing here. And yeah, we're joined with the homies. Sean, this is your truck. If you want to drive it, take the wheel.
Sure. Yeah, chapter 3. That's what we're on, right? Chronic Crisis. We'll get going, and then whoever wants to hop in after me, go ahead. As the three political movements find themselves unable to meaningfully improve voters' lives, they lean ever more heavily on the argument that their rivals pose an existential threat to democracy. The harder it is to make the case for hope, the more they rely on fear. At several points in this book, I've picked at these fear narratives. Now, in this chapter, it is time to confront them head on. I'll argue that our political leaders and commentators are fundamentally mischaracterizing our crisis. It is not an existential struggle for the survival of democracy. It's a chronic struggle over democracy's meaning. Two types of fear-mongering, one theory of crisis. Let's start by reviewing some of the arguments people use to spread fear about the future of democracy. The people who think that American democracy is an existential danger make their argument in two ways. Some make procedural arguments, alleging that the United States has drifted away from democratic norms. Procedural arguments mostly come from the center. Others make cultural arguments, suggesting that American democracy is being taken over by some enemy group. These cultural arguments mostly come from the left and the right. Procedural accounts try to draw these lessons from history. They compare the United States to countries like Hungary, Venezuela, Turkey, or Germany in the 1930s. They try to identify the warning signs in these countries' political systems and then look for similar signs in American politics. For Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, the warning signs include weak commitment to the Constitution, denying the legitimacy of political opponents, the toleration of violence, and a readiness to curtail civil liberties. In other countries, leaders have done these things and then proceeded to dismantle democratic procedures. It is easy to argue that Donald Trump did some of these things. He suggested his life would be easier if he were an autocrat. He said Hillary Clinton should be in jail. He challenged the results of the 2020 election. He often refuses to condemn extreme supporters, and he is openly contemptuous of the press. At its worst, the lessons from history argument can become pretty simple. 1. In country X, leader Y did thing Z, and then leader Y destroyed democracy. 2. In the United States, Donald Trump did thing Z. 3. Donald Trump poses an existential threat to democracy. When it takes this form, the argument brushes up against a kind of association fallacy. By associating certain behaviors with autocrats and then associating those same behaviors with Donald Trump, the lessons from history genre suggests that Trump is like Hugo Chavez, Viktor Orban, or I don't know how to say that name. Oh, Erdogan. I don't know how to say his first name. Recep Erdogan. In some sense, he might be like them. He may have a similar personality. He may even have a similar attitude to democracy, but it does not follow from there that he possesses the same threat to American democracy that those leaders pose to democracy in Venezuela, Hungary, and Turkey. The destruction of democracy doesn't just require a leader with authoritarian impulses. To destroy democracy, the would-be authoritarian needs support from the public and from other parts of the state. All right, we're doing about 4 paragraphs. I didn't say that at the start for anyone new, so whoever
I'll
wants to
jump
take it
in.
go for it.
Okay, I'll go for it. When Donald Trump tried to challenge the result of the 2020 election, he got very little support. The same Supreme Court justices he appointed helped dismiss his legal challenges. His own vice president refused to cooperate. The national security community was, if anything, more interested in deposing Trump than in supporting him in a power grab. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, put it, they may try, but they're not going to fucking succeed. You can't do this without the military. You can't do this without the CIA and the FBI. We're the guys with the guns. The stronger procedural accounts acknowledge that Trump's authoritarian tendencies are not in themselves enough to destroy democracy. Instead, they argue that Trump's behavior erodes democratic norms, increasing the willingness of American voters and institutions to support authoritarianism going forward. In a piece Levitsky and Ziblatt recently wrote for The Atlantic, they argue that the bulk of the Republican Party is now behaving in an anti-democratic manner. They suggest that in the future, the Republicans will go further than they did in 2020 and actually support an attempt to overturn an election result. Levitsky and Ziblatt argue that American democracy must be saved by democratizing it. They advocate a suite of electoral and constitutional reforms that make it harder for the Republican Party to win elections. The same authors who suggested that a weak commitment to the Constitution is a sign of authoritarianism argue that the best way to defend the Constitution is to change it. Their attempts to purify democracy look authoritarian to Republicans, and many Republican state legislatures have responded with electoral reforms that preserve the Republican Party's political competitiveness. Those voter fraud laws, in turn, look like an authoritarian form of voter suppression to Democrats. The result is an intense fight over voter access laws that diminishes the confidence of both parties' supporters in the electoral system. The less confidence voters have, the more they'll want to overturn electoral results or push for electoral reforms that will further undermine the credibility of the process for the other side. The things we do to defend democratic norms often contribute to their further erosion. Attempts to shore up democracy highlight the fact that we've ceased to agree on what it means. Cultural accounts argue that there is no unifying American identity to keep the country together. Instead, American democracy has been captured, or is in the process of being captured, by some nefarious subgroup. Progressive accounts emphasize the control of white supremacists and fascists. Carol Anderson, a professor of African American studies, argues that white rage has undermined democracy and warped the Constitution. Joe Fagan, a sociologist, goes further, arguing that the American Constitution has always been racist and that a new constitutional convention is needed to free it from racism's grip. The philosopher Jason Stanley combines elements of these positions. Like Fagan, he argues that fascism's roots have been present in the United States for more than a century. But like Anderson, he argues that fascism is ascendant today. Stanley explicitly accuses Donald Trump of fascist political tactics and associates Trump's white supporters with fascist lines of thinking. As we discussed in Chapter 2, conservative accounts emphasize tribal identity groups, unassimilable immigrants, and a decadent elite, and cultural Marxists. It should not surprise us that each of these sides regards the other as a threat to democracy, and each accuses the other of using democratic language as a cover for sinister goals.
I'll jump in. Both the procedural and cultural accounts share certain core features. They both describe a period in which democratic norms are eroded, or in which a nefarious group gains power and influence. During this period, American democracy is in danger, but it has not yet been annihilated. There remains some chance that democracy might be saved. If, however, the warning signs are ignored, then the norms continue to be eroded, or the nefarious group continues to gain power, until eventually there is a moment of reckoning. This is the moment when American democracy is truly destroyed. German historian Reinhard Koselleck argued that political legitimacy crises have two phases. In the latent phase, the state and society become morally alienated from one another. The state neglects the values of its citizens. In response, the citizens increasingly abandon the state's values. Eventually, the gap between citizens' values and the values of the state becomes too large for the citizens to continue to accept the state's political order. In the acute phase, the citizens reject the order, and there is a revolt or revolution of some kind. Both the procedural and cultural accounts make arguments that fit within Koselleck's frame. The American state is associated with a set of democratic values, but then Americans drift away from that value set. either through the erosion of norms or through the nefarious influence of radical groups. For these writers, we may still be in the latent phase, but the acute phase is coming. And when it arrives, American democracy will face existential danger. While we are still in the latent phase, we need to do something to prevent escalation to the acute phase. Many of these contemporary writers argue that we have to do something to restore norms or to weaken the nefarious groups. Koselleck argued that the state cannot afford to ignore the values of its citizens. When citizens are drifting away from democratic values, the state needs to intervene in the culture to stop this drift. If it is not proactive in the latent phase, it will be forced to act in the acute phase. In that phase, democracy's very survival is called into question. Therefore, it is dangerous and irresponsible for political leaders to wait for the acute phase. They must act in the latent phase while there is still time. Problems with Koselleck's theory. I don't know, does somebody want to take it up from a new section?
Yeah, I can go. Problems with Koselleck's theory. Koselleck's theory treats political crises mainly as a question of values. On his view, the fact that citizens have different values from the state itself suggests that an acute crisis is coming. The more separation between the values of the political establishment and the values of wider society, the more cause there is for concern. Even if the value disagreement does not begin as disagreement about democracy, the fact that democracy is unable to give voters what they value means that voters will lose their commitment to the democratic political system over time. On this view, if voters want the unsolvable problem resolved, the fact that the state cannot solve it will gradually push voters to reject the democratic political system. The American political elite is committed to the global economic order, either because they believe in it or because they see no alternative to it that is consistent with getting re-elected. They see no alternative to it that is consistent with getting re-elected. The voters are frustrated. They resent the economic system, or at the very least, they resent its consequences and the various social and cultural groups they blame for those consequences. Sooner or later, on this theory, that resentment will metastasize and spread to the democratic system itself. The theory sounds persuasive if you stay on its terrain. When I wrote my master's thesis in 2014, it was more or less what I believed, but I eventually moved away from this position for four key reasons. The United States has an advanced economic toolkit that enables it to buy time. As Wolfgang Streeck argues, it is possible to use a mixture of public and private debt, quantitative easing, and stimulus spending to cushion the blow of economic shocks. By quickly injecting cash into the economy, these measures prevent Americans from becoming so miserable that they have nothing to lose. After the coronavirus, the United States endured a deep recession, but it was able to avoid instability with relatively modest package of stimulus checks and loans to businesses. It did not have to make any deep structural reforms to the economic system, and its political system made short work of Donald Trump's attempt to challenge the results of the election. Other countries often struggle to implement emergency economic measures, but, bondholders give the American federal government a lot of room to get itself out of tough spots. Interest rates on US treasuries continue to be very low, often even lower than the inflation rate. It's difficult for an economic crisis to produce a political crisis in a country with such easy access to credit. Bondholders don't want the global economic system to fail, and they will back the federal government as long as they believe the federal government is acting to defend the system. I can continue, or I don't know if this was 4 or 3.5. Despite everything that American citizens have had to endure over the past few decades, American politics is still heavily shaped by the idea that the United States is a democratic country. and that democracy is principally responsible for its success and longevity. While many contemporary political theorists like to challenge American democratic credentials, the United States has been justifying itself to its citizens by the appeal to democratic concepts since at least the time of Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. Contemporary commentators often deny that the early United States was a proper democracy because of slavery and voting restrictions. They have a point, but this has little to do with the way the United States has pitched itself ideologically. The United States tells its citizens that it is a democracy or a democratic republic, and most Americans at most points in American history have believed some version of this. Even prominent, highly educated Americans frame the United States as a democratic country, and many of them explicitly attributed the United States' ability to overcome Nazi Germany and outlast the Soviet Union to the advantages of the democratic political system. While there is frustration today with the way the political system is performing, the founding fathers still enjoy enormously high favorability ratings. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson enjoy favorability ratings of 94 and 89% respectively. Only 26% of Americans think the founders would approve of the state of the country, while 53% think the founders would view America as a failure. When they criticize the contemporary American system, Americans imagine themselves to be on the same side as the founders. They are interested in making the founder system work better, not in replacing it with something else.
Okay. Okay. I have thoughts, but also, I don't know if I should jump in here or if we should keep going and do thoughts later. What does everyone think?
Up to you. If you have a thought, say a thought. Yeah. Just
We've done 70-30 before. I think we've been doing 100-0, so I see no reason not to do it, Nance.
Last night or yesterday on the Happy Birthday Theory Underground stream. Was that yesterday? Yeah, that was yesterday. That guy came up. Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare guy. And when did that happen? Thursday morning? I don't know. Yeah, I think it was Thursday morning. I don't know. Like Dave texted me in the morning and he's like, "Hey, do you know about this?" And I was like, "No, man, I don't watch the news. I rely on Benjamin Studebaker to tell me everything that's important." And then I did a quick Google search and I was like, "Oh my gosh, dude! Like I take one day off from the internet because I slept the day before, and they start killing fucking billionaires and CEOs and shit." It was pretty amazing, and I laughed and I thought it was funny, and there was maybe some catharsis, there was maybe some righteous anger, feeling justified, blah blah blah, all these things. But then I realized it was like, that's actually kind of gross. Like stochastic terrorism. Several years ago on BreadTube, everybody was talking about stochastic terrorism. They were talking about like, oh, it's horrible. And Ben Shapiro is responsible for school shootings, and I disagree, but it is also true that like the media climate is very vitriolic and it's very much a zero-sum game. Everybody is talking about like the end of the world is coming, and these are actual fascists, and like we must do something. Never mind, Bernie Sanders. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Let's do DEI and let's do like affirmative positivity culture and this and that. Let's not actually try to develop structural change. Let's just play these word games. And those people who were playing those word games and trying to convince us all that playing those word games was the praxis that we need to bring about heaven on earth, We're also clutching pearls at all this stochastic terrorism, all the stochastic violence. And look, I have a fucking family. What's up in the chat, Mikey? What's cracking? I have a family, and school shootings is a very real thing that I think about. Like, I remember Columbine when that shit happened. I was in school, and that shit broke my brain when I realized I was no longer safe at school. Like, I was a potential target for a terrorist. It really did a number on my sense of security or something. But now it's just kind of like, it's passe, dude. Like, there's a fucking school shooting or a bank or a church or a mass public shooting all the time here in America. And we don't ever do anything about it. We just clutch our pearls. And there's like the NRA guys, and they're like, oh, thoughts and prayers. But then there's like the whole liberal media side, and their version of thoughts and prayers is, let's just talk about stochastic terrorism, and let's just talk about reactionaries in the media, and blah, 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 blah. And it's gross. But I also think, first of all, it's true. Like, we have a violent media environment. It is true that it's like people talk about civil war and killing people and zero-sum games. It's fucking dystopian. It's crazy. I think this is an act of stochastic terrorism, and I think we shouldn't be celebrating the murder of a person, even if he deserves it, even if there is a kind of collective sigh of relief. I don't know. It's gross. And it's also true that if we were to go out and start burning shit down, they would just like ramp up police presence and security technologies and surveillance. So it is the case that we're kind of like locked in, and there's really nothing we can do. And we're talking about the resentment, and we're talking about like the loss of faith or the lack of faith or whatever. And it's like we're painted into a corner, and no matter which way we go, we're going to like walk in the wet paint. I don't know, but that like resonates with this, what we just read, to me a little bit, because it's like there's nothing we can do. And then we have people on one side saying we are doing the radical praxis and blah, blah, blah. And then there's people on the other side saying like, but democracy, we need to care about democracy. And then there's this question of, were the founders fascists? And no. But also, I think fascism is like an intensification or an acceleration of currents and trends that were maybe innovated here in America. Like the concentration camps and ghettos and shit like that. Like, that was technology developed in our founding genocide, that now we do land acknowledgements and shit like that. Canada's got some crazy history with that stuff too. So I don't know, like, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I'm not like, I don't want to clutch my pearls about this like CEO personally. Like, I think Dave said like people die all the time. Like, it's
fucking every day, dude. Every day. And this guy has probably killed way more people than for sure.
The scales are way off. Right?
It's social murder, dude. Like, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, like, this is not a strategy. Like, going out and shooting CEOs walking on the street, not a fucking political strategy, right? It's not going to get anything done. All I'm going to say is that, hey, if you have to take your gun violence, if you have to solve problems through gun violence, if that's what you're going to do, if that's your plan already, at least you shot like someone who's like in some way responsible for what's wrong with this country, as opposed to some children, like you've mentioned Columbine. Like, at least you're not taking it out on some like just total innocents that have just nothing to do with anything you could possibly be mad about.
100%. I fully support that.
That's all.
So it's like,
not a strategy. At the same time, it's not a strategy, and I'm not advocating we do this, disclaimer or whatever. But it's just like it might just make things worse in the end, or just change nothing at all.
So that's, and I think I agree with you, Sean, and I like where you're coming from, because it's like, well, the violence is going to happen. The violence is happening. The violence has been happening. The violence is a structural component of the democracy that we live in. Like, it is a necessary feature, like, in order to have the the fucking excess that some people have in our world, there has to be like a complete dearth, like a complete like lack, a destitution. That like it has to be that way. Economically, like numbers wise, and also symbolically, and like people have to have like a justification. There has to be some kind of narrative. So it's happening. We're not going to stop it without large structural change. But like I don't know. I wonder if there's like a better strategy for media people to be doing right now. It kind of feels like it's like a harm reduction thing. Like the fucking junkie's going to shoot up regardless. So maybe if we provide structures and systems to reduce the harm that they're going to do to themselves and to others, maybe that might be like a first step in actually addressing the cause of the problem. Maybe horses.
No, of course not.
Oh,
A horse, of course, if you prefer. You know, if you like a little bit of jaunt in your replies. But no, I think that's exactly it. I think the elephant in the room here is asking you if you have, you know, health insurance to continue this therapy session. Like, you know, instead of like it's do see the question seems to be, you know, or at least what's coming is the whole, do CEOs have the right to exist? And it's like, we're asking the wrong question. We're asking the wrong question. Why do we even get to the point where the question we're asking is, does X and Y have the right to exist? Like, they do exist. You know, how long have they existed? What has happened in that time? And that's exactly what you're taking account of in your point there, Nats, is what other choices could we have had along this path? What information did we disregard? What strategies to sort of take the pot off the boil have we not considered? Why isn't it a situation where we're identifying the conditions that lead to the initial conditions that lead to these outcomes and trying to take all the money that we have to spend cleaning up the mess and directing it towards more preventative measures? Like, it's the same thing you see with the housing crisis. It's like, how much are we spending clearing homeless camps, and how much does it cost to build a structure, put someone in a situation where they have the access? Like, we're not even talking about it from a moral perspective at that point. We still have the master signifier as money, and we're spending less of it. We're getting more of an investment. You know, we get.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
I just want to say this is the like 1-2 punch of like neoliberal austerity. Is this like this is why anytime someone's talking about cutting shit at all, I don't fucking trust them. And that's
Of course
that's
not.
that's not to say that there isn't massive amounts of government waste. There fucking is. Huge amounts of government waste. But every time someone finds like 3 absurd things that taxpayer money is being wasted on, they stick one thing in there that you actually give a fuck about, and they take it all with them on the way out. And then the 1-2 punch is that you do the cuts first. You do the cuts to some like programs that help people in the inner city or whatever, and then all of a sudden violence goes up because people are desperately trying to survive. And then the state funding, the money comes right back in the form of policing. It's just a 1-2 punch. So it's just conveniently we need to spend government money again in just a worse way than we were doing it before. So it's just like I don't want to be conspiratorial, but at the same time I'm like, is this entirely unintentional?
I don't even think you have to be conspiratorial. They're responding to incentives, right? Like when you have a problem with your microwave and it doesn't heat your food and you're worried about your electrical bill, you solve the I can't heat my food problem by not running your microwave as long. Like it's ridiculous. It's a sort of learned helplessness. Like you're either adding more energy to a system that's already wasting it, or you're, you know, trying to deprive it of energy with the false belief that that's going to somehow change its nature. Like, what the hell are we doing? Can we not send a technician in? This is what people who have to hire people who actually do the work think problem solving is. Gas brake. They're not trying to figure out why the engine's making noise because they've never done that before.
To tie it back to our reading a little bit too.
Turn my camera on.
Yeah, good idea.
To tie it back to our reading a little bit too, I think, you know, what's so interesting about this book, and so like sort of changed the way I think about things about this book, is that part of the conditions that we're talking about is that the political system we live under is extraordinarily stable. It's so stable that we can live in such a shitty situation and the government can still be maintain minimal legitimacy. And so I think the reaction to, in the spaces that I'm in, the reactions to the shooting have been twofold. One is kind of this like a shocking act of political violence. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, a shocking act of political violence. And there's sort of an underlying feeling of like, our democracy is really unstable. All it takes is one of these and everything goes crazy. So we can't do these because if we do that, then everything's going to fall apart. And then on the other hand, the people who are like, yeah, hell yeah, let's do this more. They're like, yeah, bring on the police repression because the police repression will highlight the government's illegitimacy, which will lead to a revolution. And, you know, I think what's really interesting about this reading is it says to both of those things, no, that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is not that you're going to substitute school shootings with CEO shootings. You're just going to add more CEO shootings. It's just going to be this increased level of violence, but the system is incredibly capable of maintaining legitimacy.
Yeah, dude.
Throughout the whole thing. So that's part of what I think is really interesting.
Yeah. No, you're
Excellent
right. It's
point.
amazing how it just keeps fucking churning, and that's I think what Benjamin's sort of pointing out is like, it's like it seems to magically just keep going, you know?
Mm.
Yeah, and
Has anybody ever
like,
seen? Sorry, go ahead, Kier.
yeah, there can just be such a huge gap. Like I used to be in the eat the rich camp, you know, and I feel like I don't know. I know that like there's like way more violent political rhetoric than there used to be, and that does seem like a bad thing overall. Like I know like Justin Trudeau up here has had to like cancel appearances and stuff based on like like creepy conspiratorial like threats and whatever, and like that seems bad. But on the other hand, I'm like, I don't know, like Off With His Head is like kind of a classic, and I'm also like, I don't know, like I think that like I don't want to like become like such a literalist that I'm like, oh no, like it's morally bad to say off with his head, you know, like or if you think someone's a horrible leader and they get COVID, it's like of course you want them to fucking die. Like why would you want them to live? You don't, you know? And I don't know. I don't want to like get to a point of like puritanism where I don't know, like we judge people morally for what I think are these like emotional and sort of like largely performative moments, right? Like the people like that are online making memes about like killing CEOs, they're not going to go do that. Like maybe one or two will, but like most of them aren't. They're blowing off steam. And I think it's really actually quite interesting because it's like, what does the FBI do when everybody's saying they're going to kill a CEO? Like you won't catch me saying it. I would never say that and I would never do it. But a lot of people are saying it all at the same time. And I think like I find that kind of fascinating. But I think like one of the big problems is that like, I don't know, the rich people were never doing any like concrete organizing around class, and the thing is like it's boring. Like that's like the trap of activism is it's like, okay, do you do something like splashy and bold? Because ever since like photography was invented, like that's when mass gathering started being a form of protest, right? Because it made a good picture, and so you're looking for these pictures, and it's hard to take a picture of like fighting to raise the welfare rates. Like what is when I was part of a campaign, we figured out one thing. You know, we got people to take pictures of like the thing that they would get for themselves if they had the extra money. So then we could, you know, put up pictures of that. There's stuff like that, but I don't know. It's tough to make like a materially focused, class focused, like slow and steady social movement, like sexy or newsworthy. And I think that like it's gonna like social media, it has the same sort of needs that media does of like sex and violence. And so I don't know what the solution is there, but I think I don't want to become too literal in like interpreting people's responses to the CEO shooting. Because, yeah, I think in a totally theoretical, hypothetical way, I think it's badass. But yeah, someone's dead, and that person was responsible for a lot of other deaths, and the whole thing is fucking tragic also.
It reminds me of a movie I watched very recently, coincidentally, and I think it was. But if you've never seen the Bader Meinhof complex, and you don't mind subtitles over German, absolutely recommend it. It's yeah, it's a real gruesome look at what these kind of, if we just do something shocking and get the ball rolling, everyone will rise up. It's very much a really really good look at that from all kinds of interesting angles, and yeah, I just think for the moment it's extremely poignant. If you get the chance, check it out.
The podcast, shit, what's it called? I think it's Behind the Bastards, or It Could Happen Here. It's like an anarchist podcast, but they have a whole series on the Bader Meinhof, that whole thing. So that's if you.
Oh, awesome.
Further, yeah, but let's keep moving with the text.
Oh, yeah.
Where did we leave off? I think we left off at this. There are no alternatives to democracy in italics, I think.
Yep. I'll go.
All right, and then Nance, are you gonna go?
Yeah.
Oh.
There are no alternatives to democracy that appear viable to most American citizens. On the contrary, most alternatives to democracy frighten most Americans, and the fear that democracy might be replaced by something else motivates a lot of our political action. And that was a quote. Who was that from?
No, I think these are just subheadings for the arguments that Studebaker's laying out.
Okay, yeah.
The 4 reasons, if you recall.
Yeah. I forgot. My brain's not working. Before the United States fought World War II and the Cold War, it was easier for Americans to entertain the possibility of adopting a fascist or communist system. Communism and fascism were still new and unproven ideas, and the United States had not yet defined itself against them. But even before World War II, communism and fascism struggled to gain traction. While the Socialist Labour Party displaced the Liberal Party in the UK, the Democratic Party saw off challenges from upstart socialist parties. Perennial third-party socialist presidential candidate Eugene Debs never won more than 6% of the vote. Wealthy Nazi sympathizers with ties to veterans groups plotted against Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, but they didn't advance beyond the planning stages. They were exposed by the very man they planned to make dictator, a retired general named Smedley Butler. Smedley Butler is fucking cool as shit. Butler,
Pew, 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 pew.
Yeah. Butler was known mostly for his pacifism. It's not a very useful trait in a coup leader. Once the United States began defining itself against fascism and communism, support for these alternatives began to appear un-American. And once Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union collapsed, they were largely discredited. Today, they function mainly as terms of abuse. Democrats accuse Republicans of fascism, and Republicans accuse Democrats of communism precisely because these systems are so thoroughly discredited that it's a political liability to be associated with them. No other compelling alternative political systems have emerged over the past 30 years. A full 85% of Americans have a negative view of Russia, and only 6% have confidence in Vladimir Putin's ability to do the right thing. Nearly as many Americans have a negative view of China. More than 70% of U.S. voters consistently say that it would be too risky to give U.S. presidents more power to deal directly with the country's problems. That includes 66% of Democrats under the Obama administration and 66% of Republicans under Trump.
This reminds me of the thing that Chris Catron brings up sometimes, that quote where he's like, Donald Trump says that what does he say? Like, Bernie's a crazy socialist, Amla's a crazy socialist, but we can respect them, but we can't respect Kamala because she's a communist.
Yeah, it's fucking.
Fuck. Next is going to be Mike, if you'd like to go, Mike.
Yeah, you bet. I'll take the next heading. The promise of saving our democracy with procedural reforms continues to excite many Americans, even though these reforms have poor prospects. An overwhelming 85% of Americans feel the political system needs to be completely reformed or needs major changes. Substantial numbers of people support eliminating the Electoral College, redrawing gerrymandered congressional districts, increasing voter access, dumping the Senate filibuster, and reining in the role of money in politics. Smaller minorities support more drastic measures, such as changing the way the Senate allocates seats. Every congressional session, more than 60 constitutional amendments are proposed by members of Congress. In 2014, former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens even wrote a book explicitly recommending 6 district amendments. None of these amendments go anywhere. The Constitution hasn't been successfully amended since 1992. Joe Biden ran on the For the People bill, which included many individually popular procedural reforms, but after narrowly squeaking through the House, the bill died in the Senate, with Democrats unwilling to circumvent the filibuster to pass it. Even on those rare occasions where bipartisan reforms have been enacted, they have not amounted to much. The McCain-Feingold Act attempted to rein in the power of wealthy donors, but its scope was heavily limited by the need to avoid running afoul of the Supreme Court. It focused on formal campaign spending, and it failed to do much about informal campaign spending, or informal political spending, by organizations that distance themselves from the specific campaigns. Even with these accommodations, McCain-Feingold was heavily diminished by subsequent court rulings like the Citizens United decision. For the People and McCain-Feingold were not dramatic reform. They would even not bring American democracy procedures in line with European examples. And European democracies themselves struggle to hold back the growing power of oligarchs and corporations. But even these petty political reforms cannot survive our heavily gridlocked legislative process. Nonetheless, Americans would rather get excited about doomed reforms than support alternatives to democracy. Even though most of the reforms will never pass, and even though most of the reforms are too weak to stand any chance of unlocking solutions to the unsolvable problem, Americans still prefer to continue pursuing them. That's how committed Americans are, not just to democracy, but to the US Constitution. Even changing the way senators are allocated goes too far. Less than 30% of American voters support that reform. As much as our political system frustrates and infuriates our citizens, they see no viable alternative to it. This is the key fact about the American crisis, and it's the fact that the fearmongers overlook and downplay time and time again. When push comes to shove, Americans will stick with a system they consider dysfunctional rather than take the risk of trying an alternative system of government, they cannot existentially threaten democracy. The crisis can never escalate to coastal execute level. How many paragraphs is that? 3?
3-ish. You can do one more if you
I
want.
can take this next chunk. Yeah, no problem. Does that mean that there's no crisis at all? Political theorist Andrew Gamble argues democracy can be in crisis even when its survival is never called into question. His account of crisis is very different from causal. Gamble contrasts situational crises with structural crises. Situational crises are particular moments that require an immediate response from the state. Structural crises are a condition rather than an event. In this crisis condition, the state becomes mired in long-term and persistent deadlocks. These deadlocks lead to a large number of situational crises, but none of these crises moments threaten the survival of democracy. On the contrary, it is the fact that these moments of crises do not threaten democracy that allows a structural crisis to continue producing moments of crisis. In Koselleck's model, the fear is that a final, decisive acute crisis will arrive. In Gamble's model, the fear is that each moment of crisis will just lead to further moments in an endless stream of misery. Koselleck fears the end of the crisis, Gamble fears the opposite, a crisis without end.
Oh, this is crazy. I love the part about we are just very attached to the idea of democracy and the Constitution. This is precisely why I'm so interested in getting at, like, what do we mean when we say democracy? Because if we mean just keeping things just as they are, if that's all we mean by it, then we're not talking about democracy. This state is not democratic in any way, shape, or form. I kind of like if we can use the word democracy to sort of get at something people are talking about and then be like, hey, but what you're saying when you're saying the word democracy, is that really what you want? Because what you're saying, what you're really advocating is something that will make sure that nothing ever changes. If you're talking about democracy defined as the Constitution, essentially, you know,
Hmm.
ablate the
Yeah, it
word.
seems like there's no such thing as democracy. There's just democratic acts, and people disagree on what they are. And some people think we can never do more democratic things than we've already done. We have to like set them in stone. And then there's people who think like, no, don't. There's more democratic things to be done, and here's the things we should do.
Yeah, like to me, democracy should have something to do with like if you see a problem as a citizen, you see a problem outside of your fucking window, you should be able to go and change it and use the state to do that. You know, like in the fact that that's not even thinkable to us. We're just a normal person can do that. I mean, it does happen, but fucking rarely. Like there's the person that drove around Idaho in a bus to like close the Medicare gap and spent just years of their life for this one minuscule reform that indeed helped thousands of people. But like,
Wow.
you have to dedicate your life to changing
Yeah,
one little fucking thing. You know what I mean? So
huge
it's like
sacrifice. Yeah.
huge sacrifice of time and energy. And so it's like, is it really reasonable to expect everyone who's working full time to like
Yeah.
throw their whole lives into closing one little reform, one little loophole that people are falling through? It's insane. You know, like
It's
that's not a
supposed to mean consent to the governed, right? And like
yeah.
if in order to even exercise or at least, articulate that consent, like your whole life has to be a act of enunciation. That's patently ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, it's insane because it's just the level of bureaucracy that we're experiencing is just out of control. It's insane. And
Yeah,
then
it's like
but
your
we
life is a
need to
filibuster.
yeah, your life is a filibuster, right? And we need to keep increasing it because we need the bureaucracy, the like state bureaucracy to offset the corporate bureaucracy, which is trying to just
Hmm.
turn us into fuel, essentially. So it's
Ooh.
like it just keeps going up back and forth. Then that's the only options we have is just increase the bureaucracy to protect ourselves from the other bureaucracy. There has to be something else.
Yeah, I'm really glad there's going to be like some seminars on critical bureaucracy studies next year because I think that yeah, it's like crazy that there are these institutions that really do have so much power over people's lives, but they are kind of like yeah, they have this veil of like I don't know, not only legitimacy but also like as if they're benign or neutral and like they're kind of making these like fair decisions when it seems a lot more arbitrary than that a lot of the time. But it's kind of striking me that like democracy is almost like the word is almost functioning as like a thought terminating cliche, where
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
when it gets invoked, you have to back away from like whatever it was that you were criticizing or whatever. Um, because you can't touch that. And it's funny because I don't know, it's like the way that Studebaker is also drawing like a bit of a parallel between the ways that like leftists call conservatives fascists and conservatives call leftists communists. Like that's really interesting to me because it's like it's easy for me to see, when the conservatives call Kamala a communist, like that is hilarious. Because I have a better idea of like what communism means, but I don't know. I've been confused about how seriously to take the other direction, right? Like is Trump a fascist? Are the Republican Party fascists? And again, like yeah, do the declarations that Trump make him a fascist? Like, is there a direct line between the crazy shit that he says and has always said, and like not only like his vision, but also like the strategies of people around him, particularly because like the CIA and FBI like did not like Trump at all, and the military didn't really like him very much either. And if he's like alienated all those groups, then like I don't see, I don't know, he doesn't seem like much of a threat if he's like so hot-headed that he can't even like make these like alliances that would be crucial for him to like actually seize power. But I don't know. I'm also like, am I missing something? Like, am I being naive and not being more concerned about like impending fascism? So, yeah, this chapter is like really fascinating. And the last thing I'll say is like, as much as like as many problems as there are with like Canadian democracy, which is where I am, it's like it's still like very like acute for me to, you know, hear someone who moved here from a country where like either you can't vote or you might get shot dead for trying to vote, um, that they can walk into a poll here and that there aren't any gangs or mobs outside the door. There's no one pressuring you to make a certain choice. There are more than one parties on the ballot. Like, that's real. And I don't want to get like so cynical about democracy or the state of our democracy that like we lose sight of that, because there are lots of places where like you cannot take that shit for granted, and people are like laying their lives on the line to try and create that experience at the polls that I get without any effort every time there's an election, you know? And there's like, as much as I can complain about my representative, like I still get to do that. We still get to do that, you know? And yeah, I think that that's like, I want to keep perspective on that.
Here, I hear you. I have a similar like reaction with like an Iranian friend of mine who's like very enthusiastic about liberalism to in a way that struck me as just like strange at first, because I'm like, who cares about liberalism? Whatever. Like when a couple years ago when I first met him, I was like, what are you talking about? But like coming from his perspective, bordering Iraq, having a lot of problems with he just has a different perspective on the world and a different perspective on like free elections and the importance of these things, of course. But I also feel like, to a certain extent, the reason why we have such free and fair elections and there are no mobs at the polls is because they don't matter. You know, like to some extent, it's because they don't matter. That's why no one is, you know, intimidating you about who you should vote for and who you shouldn't vote for. You know, so
No, that's a great point.
yeah.
That's a great point.
Um,
And as soon as a
if you know what I
social
mean.
movement like actually like has anything uh yeah, is actually getting close to any sort of alternative, like they get completely crushed. So you're right.
I mean, I think we're both right in a way, but okay, I'm gonna pick up reading now. Actually, can somebody else?
I mean, I can take those last two dangling sentences that I left there. I felt kind of bad about that because I didn't realize that the next page was another heading.
Yeah, go for
So just to finish it off, this insight from Gamble is incredibly valuable. It allows us to think about the American crisis in a completely different way. And in the next section, I'll build on Gamble's theory and develop an alternative account of the American crisis. And then there's the next heading.
I'll jump in
All right, no,
unless
I'm good.
Sean,
I'm good
you're back.
now. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, go for it.
All right, here we go. The chronic legitimacy crisis and alternative model. I want to suggest that the United States faces a chronic legitimacy crisis. A chronic legitimacy crisis is chronic because all the ways of resolving the crisis quickly are straightforwardly blocked. Like Gamble's structural crises, My chronic crisis features long-term and persistent deadlocks that immiserate Americans over and over again. These deadlocks never destroy the American political system, but they also prevent it from taking any meaningful steps to resolve the crisis. The system is stuck in place. It goes on deadlocking no matter what we try. The chronic legitimacy crisis is a crisis of legitimacy in the sense that it raises a question about whether our political system is, in philosopher Bernard Williams' words, acceptable. Acceptability is about whether the political system appears justified to each of the state's subjects. Citizens accept justifications for the system to the extent that they tolerate it, even when it does things that they resent. It's easy to think of legitimacy as something a political system either has or doesn't have. You could frame this as a binary and argue that either our citizens tolerate our political system or they don't. But I think it's more helpful to think of legitimacy in a more sophisticated way. There are at least 4 levels of legitimacy: 1, perfect; 2, full; 3, minimal; 4, liminal. Perfect legitimacy. When the political system has perfect legitimacy, citizens accept the kind of system they have and specific decision-making procedures that make up that system, and the specific decisions those procedures yield. If the United States had perfect legitimacy, Americans would not only accept democracy, but they would also believe that its specific procedures are swell, that accept that political they'd accept what political theorist John Rawls calls the constitutional essentials or basic structure of the system. That includes things like the branches of government, the electoral system, the relationship between the federal government and the states, and so on. They would also accept every decision those procedures yield. No political system is perfect, and no political system ever achieves perfect legitimacy. That's probably a good thing. Perfect legitimacy is kind of creepy. A system with perfect legitimacy does not need to do anything to satisfy its citizens. It does not have to adapt or evolve. Its citizens fully embrace the justifications it offers them. So, want to pick up full legitimacy?
I can jump in here.
Go ahead.
Full legitimacy. I love Studebaker's like little flourishes. Perfect legitimacy is kind of creepy, and the use of swell. I'm just like, excellent.
That threw me when I was reading it. I didn't expect the word swell to be in there. I
So
like it though.
good. Just these little personality moments coming through. Um, Full legitimacy. When the system has full legitimacy, citizens accept the kind of political system they have, and they accept the constitutional essentials and basic structure, but they're frequently unhappy with the specific decisions the government makes. Sometimes they don't like particular elected officials, or they disagree with specific laws or court decisions. They do, however, feel that the political system operates fairly. They may not like the results of a given election, but they don't want to change the way elections work. They might not like some of the laws, but they don't want to change the legislative process. When their side loses, they accept defeat without trying to change the rules. Defeat is okay because they believe in the system and they believe that they stand a fair chance of winning next time. They may be critical of the government, but they're fiercely loyal to the political process. They have a kind of political sportsmanship. They're good losers. Unlike perfect legitimacy, full legitimacy is compatible with a level of diversity, of pluralism. John Rawls often expressed a desire for an overlapping consensus on the basic structure. He hoped different people with different values could agree on the same constitution for different reasons. This thin agreement on the political procedures allows for a lot of disagreement about values and policy. Rawls associates this condition with what he calls the liberal principle of legitimacy. His principle requires that power is only exercised in accordance with a constitution, written or unwritten, the essentials of which all citizens, as reasonable and rational, can endorse in the light of their common human reason. Minimal legitimacy. Unfortunately for Rawls, full legitimacy is itself extremely difficult to obtain. Most of the time, some of the people who lose political debates find defeat unacceptable. They set about trying to reform political procedures to make them fairer, and their notion of fairness often has a lot to do with whatever enables them to win. It would be easy to assume that these people pose an existential threat to democracy. In their book, Acemoglu and Robinson paint political sore losers as the principal threat to what they call inclusive institutions. But many of these citizens remain committed to the democratic system. The reforms they demand are relatively innocuous, like electoral and campaign finance reform. While many of the winners might oppose the sore losers' reforms, it is not straightforwardly the case that the losers' reforms would destroy democracy. Indeed, the losers make democratic arguments for their reforms, arguing that these reforms would eliminate corruption, weaken entrenched elites, and make the system more democratic and inclusive than it was before. When there's agreement that the political system should be a democracy, but not on the constitutional essentials and basic structure, the political system has minimal legitimacy. Under minimal legitimacy, people still care deeply about democracy, but they feel the political system is failing to live up to democratic promises. They want real democracy, freed from corruption and dysfunction. They feel the procedures need to be substantially reformed and that the existing form of democracy just isn't good enough. For them, the existing procedures have failed to express the idea of democracy. They remain loyal to the democratic idea, but not to specific political structures that have been adopted in its name. Minimal legitimacy is even more pluralist than full legitimacy. The reformers all agree that the existing structure is inadequate, that democracy needs to be purified. But they often have completely different ideas about how democracy should be restructured. They might want to substantially change the electoral system, the legislative process, or the distribution of power among the branches of government. They might want to increase the power of the federal government at the expense of the states, or vice versa. Ask 6 different reformers how we should go about trying to save democracy, and they may give you 6 different answers. I'll just do this last paragraph here. Minimal legitimacy, therefore, contains much more conflict and division than full legitimacy. Sometimes reform proposals are so different from one another that the would-be reformers come to despise each other at least as much as they despise the defenders of the dysfunctional system. This results not in straightforward binary polarization, but in multipolar politics. Multiple factions of reformers spring up, attacking both the status quo and each other. As the status quo weakens, its dwindling defenders are forced to exploit divisions among the reformers, pitting different reform movements against each other in an increasingly desperate bid to limit the amount of reform. I'll say something really quick on this, just because British Columbia had an interesting referendum, I don't know, maybe 6-7 years ago, and it actually was to, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically supposed to be like a more democratic system of voting where you actually get to rank the people on the ballot rather than just picking one person. Maybe it's like called proportional representation or something like that.
Ranked choice voting, isn't that what it's called?
That might be it, yeah. And I'm fuzzy on the details because it was quite a while ago now. But I supported it, but it didn't go through. And it's crazy because it took like years and years and years to even get the referendum, on the ballot after like a previous failure. And it got rejected. And I think my understanding is that like the fear was that like really fringe parties would be able to like gain a foothold in the legislature, and I think that was largely unfounded. But this idea again of these like radicals even being able to have like one representative or 2 in the legislative assembly was like enough to just nix the entire project that I saw as like a move towards in the democratic direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to build on that, I feel like not only is I feel like part of what he's getting at in this book is that in addition to the word democracy being sort of a cliche that is thought terminating, it's also a self-legitimating cliche in the sense that the reason that the left and right call each other fascists and communists is because they're saying, I am a Democrat. I believe in democracy. They do not. And also part of what he gets at is that we're inheritors of the results of the 20th century, in the sense that for normal people, if you tell them communism, they think about Stalin. And if you tell them authoritarianism, they think about Hitler. So both of those are totally delegitimized, so that you can have things that even minimal reforms that will not solve what Studebaker calls the unsolvable problem of capital flows, they can still be like shot down, because you can play on this sphere of like somebody who's either a fascist or a communist or a white nationalist, but all that is to say, not a Democrat, small d. That is enough for people to just totally hit the no fucking way button forever, basically.
Mm-hmm. And Dan, you are up next if you want to take it at liminal legitimacy.
Sure. Liminal legitimacy. In cases where there isn't even agreement on the regime type, we have only liminal legitimacy. Under liminal legitimacy, people abandon even the idea of democracy, actively promoting authoritarian political systems and valuing them for their own sake. This is the point where there's a real existential threat to democracy, where there's an imminent threat of an acute crisis. Under liminal legitimacy, people feel that even the idea of democracy has failed. They have stopped caring about democratic values. They just want to win, and they're willing to embrace any system of government that allows them to win. But things don't get this far in the United States, because the United States has an advanced economic toolkit, a deeply entrenched democratic ideology, a lack of compelling alternatives, and a persistent attachment to the idea of reform. American political legitimacy does not drop below the minimal level. No matter how frustrated we become with our democracy, the vast majority of us remain committed to democracy as a political system or as an ideal. Chronic crises occur when we get stuck in minimal legitimacy. Most of the time, in practice, the American political system enjoys a level of legitimacy somewhere between full and minimal. The closer we come to full legitimacy, the more we feel there is a sense of consensus, that some kind of normal situation has been established. Think of the post-war consensus in the late 50s and early 60s, or quote-unquote morning in America in the mid-80s. During these periods, there's a lot of bipartisan behavior because political differences are smaller and less fundamental. The closer we come to minimal legitimacy, the more we feel the political system is in crisis. Think of the crisis of confidence in the late 1970s and early 1980s, or the intense polarization that increasingly marks the 21st century, especially after the global economic crisis of 2008. We feel the system is in crisis in part because it's very easy to confuse minimal legitimacy with liminal legitimacy. When we have minimal legitimacy, there's disagreement about what democracy means. Each faction wants to save democracy with a set of purifying reforms, but each faction thinks that the other faction's reforms are a threat to democracy. Each faction frames its rivals as authoritarian. Each faction is constantly fear-mongering about threats to democracy. Before too long, nearly everyone agrees that democracy is in danger, even though nearly everyone wants to defend democracy. Even if there's no chance that legitimacy will become liminal, a prolonged period in which the political system is stuck in minimal legitimacy causes trouble. For Williams, legitimacy crises are driven by resentment. The more resentment people feel, the less legitimacy there is. Resentment is in turn driven by lack of identification with the actions of the state. When the political system doesn't solve the unsolvable problem, but instead defends the interests of oligarchs and corporations, citizens increasingly feel unable to identify with political decisions. They start to suppose that the state is ignoring their interests because its procedures are dysfunctional or have been captured by some enemy group. Increasingly, their political action is motivated by a desire to fix the procedures, to drive out the enemy, and often to fix the procedures in a way that drives out the enemy. Political debates become increasingly meta. We are constantly discussing the procedures and enemy groups. We stop using the procedures to issue decisions because we have no confidence that the procedures are capable of issuing good decisions. We fall into long-term and persistent deadlocks. Pressing problems are ignored. The economic sources of resentment are never properly addressed. Politicians induce voters to identify with them by adopting the voters' enemies as their own, because it's easier to mirror voters' emotions than it is to break the deadlock and deliver meaningful economic change. I think that's 4.
Yep, that's 4. Next up would be Luke.
In our chronic crisis, the political system cannot deliver more than minimal legitimacy for an extended period of time. A functional political system pushes towards full legitimacy by proactively dealing with sources of resentment. But our political system is unable to deal with the source of our resentment. And as the resentment builds, it takes over our entire political culture. No one agrees on what democracy concretely means, procedurally. Everyone thinks their reforms support democracy, but everyone thinks everyone else's reforms are an attempt to rig it. Attempts to purify democracy are confused with attempts to destroy it. The harder people try to save democracy, the more they appear to be its enemies. We end up in an endless conversation about political reform and cultural struggle. Amidst this cacophony of resentment and rage, the true sources of resentment struggle even to get on the political agenda in the first place. Unable to proactively deal with the economic sources of resentment, the United States cannot push for full legitimacy. Unable to reject democracy in favor of some other system, it cannot fall into liminal legitimacy. It is trapped in minimal legitimacy indefinitely, and for that reason, it's in a chronic crisis. Now, you might have a friend who thinks it's obvious that the political reforms they prefer are compatible with democracy. They cannot understand how anyone honestly believes that their political reforms are authoritarian. They are sure people who accuse them of authoritarianism are acting in bad faith. Perhaps your friend thinks those people are acting in bad faith because they're the real authoritarians. There are some theorists who have argued that certain kinds of political reforms are straightforwardly authoritarian. Nancy Bormeo argues that the democratic backsliding is frequently done in the name of making the political system more democratic. She argues that some reforms amount to executive aggrandizement or strategic election manipulation. Theorists writing in her vein often argue that we can tell the difference between benign and harmful democratic reforms. If that were so, the chronic crisis would be easier to navigate. We would simply support the good democratic reforms and oppose the bad quasi authoritarian reforms. I don't think it's that simple. I want to say a little more about why it's so easy to confuse attempts to save democracy with attempts to kill it. I believe those were 4.
Yeah. Someone else wants to take the. It's gonna be Nance next.
Why purification reforms are confused with authoritarianism. To understand why it is so difficult to draw a clear line between purifying reforms and authoritarianism, it's important to understand that people support democracy for different reasons, and their reasons sometimes conflict with each other. In their discussion of the advantages of democracy, North, Wallace, and Weingast emphasize 2 distinct features. Democracies are dynamic. They are adaptable. When a democratically elected government performs poorly, it can be voted out. New governments can change policy. This allows democracies to try many different policies in response to problems. Authoritarian states often get stuck with policies that don't work. They cannot easily U-turn on their policies without looking incompetent. They have no formal procedural mechanism for changing leadership when it's clear that change is needed. Because they have such a hard time changing governments and changing policies, they often respond to resentment by trying to repress it. They crack down on dissent, and this makes their citizens fear the consequences of complaining. When citizens stay silent, authoritarian states don't see problems coming until they're very serious. Once a problem arises, they may only get one shot at solving it. If their first solution fails, They struggle to change strategy, and the consequences of sticking with a bad strategy can pile up quickly. Democracies are credible. They are predictable. Democracies have impersonal decision-making institutions. These institutions observe the rule of law. They reliably perform in a consistent way. Authoritarian states often rely heavily on particular individuals. Those individual leaders can be capricious and arbitrary in their decisions. Even when the leaders are consistent, the system depends too much on individual leaders to maintain that consistency. If a leader dies or leaves office, there is no guarantee that the next leader will honor the commitment of their predecessor. Democracy's mechanistic procedures, their complex systems of checks and balances, diminish the power and influence of particular individuals and produce more predictable results over time. The trouble is that these two advantages do not obviously go together neatly. Credibility is associated with predictability, and dynamism is associated with change. The more dynamic a democracy is, the less credible it is, and the more credible a democracy is, the less dynamic it is. If you vote in a new government and it makes sweeping changes, the credibility of the system is threatened. If elections don't meaningfully change policy, then they don't offer much in the way of dynamism.
It's going to be Mike next.
Can you hear me? Does
Yep.
that mute button work? Okay, excellent. Ending off from in the way of dynamism. When the left, the right, and the center look at our democratic system, they see different problems with it. Sometimes they're worried that our system isn't dynamic enough. Elections come and go, but neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are able to win enough seats in Congress to make many of the changes that the left and right feel we need. They're frustrated because their hopes keep getting disappointed. Even the center sometimes gets frustrated with gridlock when it struggles to raise the debt ceiling or pass basic budget bills. Other times, they're worried that our system isn't credible enough. The left and the center worry that if the right wins, it will do creepy fascist things. The center and the right worry that if the left wins, it will do creepy communist things. The fear that the hopes of their enemies may prove justified. They fear that the hopes of their enemies may prove justified. And they fear that they cannot rely on our systems of checks and balances to keep the system credible and protect the status quo. Procedural reforms can shore up dynamism, but only at the expense of credibility, and they can shore up credibility, but only at the expense of dynamism. If your purification reforms are designed to increase dynamism, but your opponents think the problem is that democracy isn't credible enough, your opponents will view your reform as counterproductive and potentially authoritarian. By the same token, if your reforms are designed to shore up credibility, somebody else will think your reforms are an attack on dynamism. Real democratic procedures combine dynamism and credibility by sitting somewhere in between the two. It is not at all obvious which one should be prioritized. Some situations call for dynamisms, and some call for credibility. No set of democratic principles can perfectly produce each of these virtues whenever they're needed. It gets worse. There are two types of dynamism. When we make it easier to change the government, we don't necessarily make it easier to change policy. If it's very easy to vote out the government becomes skittish about taking policy risks. In our system, where the House of Representatives is up for election every 2 years, members of the House worry a lot about the electoral consequences of their voting decision. In some European systems, where there may be 5 years between general elections, legislators are much more secure. They can take bigger policy risks, especially early in their terms, because they know it will be a while before they can be replaced. But at the same time, if we respond by allowing politicians to avoid elections for ages, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll make the changes we want to see. Insulation from electoral pressure allows politicians to ignore popular demands or to make up unpopular legislation that favors preferred interest groups. Electoral dynamism and policy dynamism don't guarantee one another. We can have electoral dynamism without policy dynamism without electoralism, or electoral dynamism, or neither one, but it's quite hard to consistently have both. The power of oligarchs and corporations is never seriously challenged, in part because politicians do not think they can win re-elections during periods when global supply chains are disrupted. If they had longer terms, they might feel more secure, and they might be more willing to take risks. But at the same time, if they had longer terms, they could more easily ignore public resentment and go on perpetuating the status quo. We cannot be sure that increasing or decreasing electoral dynamism would produce policy dynamism. How am I? 3 in?
That'd be 4.
Okay, who's next?
That's me, I think, actually. Yeah. Ooh. So, which would help more? Should we increase electoral dynamism and make politicians more accountable to... I'm reading at the right spot, right? That's where we left off?
Yeah.
Yes, that's where I
Okay.
left off.
Okay, second. All right. So, which would help more? Should we increase electoral dynamism and make politicians more accountable to voters, or should we increase policy dynamism and give politicians more room to try bigger, riskier policy reforms? The answer is not at all obvious. If you think accountability is the problem, you'll despise efforts to give politicians more room to maneuver. If you think the politicians need to be encouraged to take political risks, you'll despise efforts to make them more accountable. Then there's the question of what we mean by authoritarianism. When many people worry about authoritarianism, they're worried about tyranny, about some particular person or branch of government gaining so much discretionary power that they become impossible to stop. But it's also possible to have authoritarian systems where no particular person or group of people have much power. In these systems, impersonal incentives supervene on individuals and groups, compelling them to obey structural imperatives. Impersonal authoritarianism isn't tyranny because it doesn't require a tyrant. It is totalitarian rather than tyrannical. Power rests not with particular people, but with a bureaucracy with its own internal logic. In totalitarian systems, the people who appear to be in charge can only occupy important offices insofar as their behavior conforms to the logic of the system they're participating in. They look powerful, but their power is an illusion, because if they try to use it to change the fundamental character of the system they're in, they lose. If they use it to change the fundamental character of the system they're in, they lose that power. Consider a corporate CEO, for instance. The power of the CEO of a public corporation is heavily limited by the fact that the CEO's power depends entirely on the CEO's ability to generate profit for shareholders. If the CEO tries to be a nice guy or faffs about, the CEO will cease to be a CEO. In this way, CEOs are not tyrants. They are beholden to the incentive structure that governs public corporations. Public corporations are totalitarian rather than tyrannical. They are dominated by impersonal bureaucracies rather than lone tyrants. If you are worried about tyranny, you respond to tyranny by decreasing the power of particular individuals and groups. You do this by creating sets of impersonal rules that circumscribe their behavior. This transfers power from particular people to impersonal systems. You combat the threat of tyranny by making the system stronger than the people who participate in it. Conversely, if you are worried about totalitarianism, you respond to it by increasing the power of individuals and groups to change structural incentives. This means giving them more autonomy from impersonal systems, and that means giving them powers that the system is unable to check. You combat the threat of totalitarianism by weakening the system and strengthening the people who participate in it. This means that in the name of defeating tyranny, we enact reforms that look totalitarian to other people. In the name of defeating totalitarianism, we enact reforms that look to... Oh, did I read that twice? Oh well. In the name of defeating totalitarianism, we enact reforms that look tyrannical to other people. Oh no, it's just backwards. Sorry, I get it. If you worry about the possibility that Donald Trump might become a tyrant, you might want to regulate the internet in such a way that Donald Trump's message cannot get out. In doing this, you increase the power of an impersonal regulatory system to check the power of a particular individual. But if you aren't worried that Donald Trump might become a tyrant, you might instead be very concerned about totalitarian takeover of the internet by the state or by transnational corporations like Facebook. The more you try to stop tyranny, the more you appear to be a totalitarian. And the more you try to stop totalitarianism, you appear to favor tyranny. In both cases, you look authoritarian even if you are trying to fight authoritarianism. That's fucking great. I hope I didn't switch the words totalitarianism and tyrannical at some point while I was reading.
I think it would just drive the point home even more.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
great way to put it. I love the way just such a succinct way to put that problem. Yeah. Anyway,
He puts a lot of work into being able to just make those simple, noun swaps in a couple of successive sentences because he did all the hard work in the paragraphs before. It's fantastic.
yeah. Yeah, and it kind of makes you think because the words are so similar. So I think it's actually kind of effective that they're easy to mix up because then it makes you go
Immensely.
back. It makes you go back over it and be like, "Wait, am I getting this right?" And then that's going to build your understanding. If you get tripped up and have to go back and be like, "Read this again."
Yeah,
So
fair
it's like
point.
the fact that it's slightly confusing is, I think, effective.
Clarity through confusion.
Of course.
Very interesting.
Next is going to be, unless someone has something to say, next is going to be Kier.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really appreciate his writing style. It's like it's clear without being dumbed down.
Yeah.
And yeah, it does come to these like really satisfying quilting points. Okay. When we come closer to achieving full legitimacy, these problems are avoided. When we agree not just on democracy as a system, but on a particular set of democratic procedures, we don't negotiate these questions about whether our procedures should be dynamic or credible, or whether we have enough electoral or policy dynamism. We don't worry about whether our system looks too close to tyranny or totalitarianism. As the historian Christopher Mextroth argues, when we have a shared history of understanding democracy in a particular way, through a particular procedural schema, this shared history allows us to bracket these procedural questions and focus on substantive issues. But as we move closer to minimal legitimacy, the historical consensus breaks down. When our shared understanding of democracy breaks down, we discover that we like democracy for very different reasons. The reforms we propose take democracy in very different directions, playing up some advantages at the expense of others. In a chronic crisis, when we change our procedures, we further erode this inherited consensus. It happens even when we change our procedures in an attempt to defend the system. The Democrats reformed the voting system to enable voters to vote by mail during the pandemic. For them, this was a common sense measure to allow voters who feared coronavirus to vote from home. It was about maintaining voter access. But it took a long time to count those mail-in ballots. The delay in the count undermined the credibility of the voting process. The fact that the voting system had been so recently changed encouraged people to cast doubt on the result. In a bid to keep voter participation up and preserve their odds of defeating Donald Trump at the ballot box, the Democrats did lasting damage to the consensus that American elections are conducted in a fair way. To increase electoral dynamism, they damaged the credibility of the voting system. Now, many Republicans want to repeal these changes, but if they repeal them, the Democrats accuse them of suppressing the vote. It is now impossible to find a new consensus that satisfies both sides. They both support democracy. They both want free and fair elections. But they no longer share an understanding of what that means. Once you break a procedural consensus, it is difficult to rebuild it. If the Electoral College were eliminated, this consensus would break down even further. The more the Democrats try to use procedural reforms to stop the authoritarian Republicans, the more the Democrats and Republicans will disagree about electoral laws. This will make the Republicans appear even more authoritarian to the Democrats, and that will make them try even harder to beat the Republicans with procedural reforms. And the harder they try to beat the Republicans with procedural reforms, the more authoritarian they will appear to the Republicans. A nasty spiral ensues in which everyone looks more and more authoritarian to everyone else, even though everybody remains firmly committed to democracy. I like this point. I think that the Republican Party and Mike Pence proved this after January 6th, at least in that moment. They didn't side with him. And so it is confusing when people try and like paint the Republican Party as like this totally anti-democratic institution. Not that there aren't elements, but Yeah. Okay, I'll do one more paragraph here. Nancy Bermeo's catalog of different forms of democratic backsliding doesn't do much to help us here. A right-wing reform that strengthens the executive might look like tyrannical executive aggrandizement to liberals. But to the right, the same reform might look like a benign way of increasing policy dynamism and combating totalitarianism. Reforms that increase voter access might look like strategic election manipulation to conservative Republicans. But to liberal Democrats, the same reforms are simply a means of ensuring that Republican state legislatures do not use voter fraud laws to strategically manipulate elections in favor of the potentially tyrannical Donald Trump. Political theorists can try to insist on definitions of executive aggrandizement or strategic election manipulation that draw clear lines, but they will draw those lines in a politically motivated way based on their own views about dynamism and credibility or tyranny and totalitarianism. There is no way to authoritatively say what counts as democratic and what reforms don't without resorting to authoritarianism. I'll do this last paragraph before the next section here. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other reasons people like democracy. Some political theorists like democracy because they think it embodies some principles of fairness. Some theorists like democracy because they think it draws on the diffuse knowledge of the whole population. Some theorists like democracy because they think it empowers national peoples, enabling their will to be discovered and implemented. Other democratic theorists object to the very idea of the nation. All of these theorists support democracy. The fact that they disagree so heavily about why we should support democracy and on what democracy concretely requires underlines the reality that we are in a prolonged period of minimal legitimacy. In such a period, it is no longer possible to straightforwardly define the boundaries of what counts as democratic thought. The theorists who attempt to find and fix definitions of democracy miss the fact that it is the impossibility of finding consensus definitions that defines this crisis. They are on a fool's errand. Damn.
Does
Yeah.
anyone else? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, like, I feel like part of this helps me understand why sometimes I feel alienated from other leftists, because I actually think I'm personally currently more concerned about totalitarian reforms than the possibility of like a tyrannical leader. And that does put us at odds sometimes, right? When it comes to like internet censorship, for example.
I'm with you there. I'm with you there. But I wanted to say, does anyone else feel like this is like a really articulate examination of precisely why everything is so fucking stupid? Like,
I mean, it seems
that is
so succinct.
frustrating, you know.
Yeah,
But he's
it's
right. It's just like he's explaining exactly why it's so fucking frustrating and nothing ever gets done. Sorry, go on, Mike.
I'm still remembering, and no, it's fine, Sean. I'm still remembering, in fact, your point earlier, which is, and I still, despite all, I can suspend my own, considerations, to understand what someone's arguing about or what their argument is, and especially someone as smart as Studebaker, at least as far as I've seen him. But I'm still with you, Sean, in the sense that like what is democracy? And it seems like this is a war of semantics until we abandon a word, and liminal is like the abandonment of the word itself. It's very, very peculiar. But of course, can't argue with the fact that what Benjamin is describing is what most people would call democratic mechanisms, right? It's incredible to see the difference that can be sustained under a word that everybody has on the tip of their tongue, but they can't even agree on like its nature. It's very interesting.
Yeah, and on that point, what he says at the end here, that the theorists who attempt to find and fix definitions of democracy miss the fact that it is the impossibility of finding a consensus definition that defines this crisis. They are on a fool's errand. Heard, Isn't the next step, though, the liminal legitimacy? Like, if we can't recover a term of democracy, if we can't figure that out, don't we just lose legitimacy and end up in a
I think
much worse
so.
scenario than we are in? Isn't that the next step down? Which means, like, which makes me want to go, like, well, Benjamin, what do you really think here? Maybe we'll find out, But I'm like,
Maybe.
do we just abandon democracy altogether? Do we just lean into throwing our lot in with the correct tyrant? Because isn't that the next step? Like, if we can't find legitimacy in the system, we move to the next. If we can't find legitimacy in the word, then we throw our lot in with our favorite tyrant.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I know what my intuition would be for solving the complex problem would be to simplify it, but I don't know if that's correct. And like you said, it's uh, Benjamin's done such a good job of describing the problem so far. I'm excited to see where he takes it from here. I mean, we're still only in chapter 3, right?
Mm-hmm. It's going to be Dan next. Oh wait, no. Who just went? Did I just hear what just went?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, it's Dan next.
Cool. Yeah, I would just throw in real quick. I certainly have no idea what comes after minimal legitimacy, but I think like the point that is being made here that I really want to hold on to is his point that minimal legitimacy can go on almost indefinitely. So it's less that we're like descending this ladder and more that
Right.
we're just like stuck in minimal legitimacy. So the fear of authoritarian. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
No, you're right, but something's gonna give eventually, right? Like someday something's gonna give, like the environmental something will catch up with us, right? Anyway, I don't know. Sorry.
No, you're right. And here's an interesting thing I'd like to pull in also that I kind of found activism through the climate movement and found it through specifically Just Stop Oil in UK. And they got a lot of folks who are, doing a lot of direct action, are in prison for that direct action. And their analysis at this point that they are very serious about is that climate change will create revolutionary conditions. And that so they are now moving beyond we're doing direct action, and they're now moving into we are trying to figure out how to plan a revolution, and they're very serious. And but I think what's so crucial about this is their revolution is entirely founded on they're like we need more democracy. They're like what will stop climate change and stop uh, fossil fuel emissions is more democracy in the UK. You know what I mean? And so it's like I think that's what's really really important about this book is that it's like I agree that absolutely that especially climate change might or might not, I mean very well could might not create revolutionary conditions, and the people right now who are claiming that revolution are claiming a revolution for more, they're claiming reform. You know what I mean? They're like, what we need is more reform. And what this book does is be like, no, 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 it's capital flows. Unless you can do something about global capital flows, you cannot do shit all.
Yeah, I like
Yeah,
that.
Anyway,
I think that
totally.
Sorry, I'll shut up after this. But I like that because I think democracy has like a meaningful sense of democracy has absolutely like fuck all to do with what we have now, even though that's the word that is being used. Like if the word is going to have any meaning or any significance in our lives, it has nothing to do with what it's being used to describe at the moment. Anyway, talking a
Yeah,
lot.
no,
So.
the Just Stop Oil stuff's fascinating. Was involved in some climate activism a long time ago, but yeah, it's like in where I live, British Columbia, Canada, like there is like this absolute gridlock because um everyone works in resource extraction. Everyone outside of the city works in resource extraction. This entire country is founded on resource extraction. It's logging, it's mining, it's oil. That's our economy. We have very little resource and research and develop. Like it's there's no country without that right now, and there's really honestly no like you would need like really ambitious and wild reforms the type of which no one is implementing in order to like move the economy anywhere else. And so you can't rely on democracy. Like we don't have good enough climate policy here in British Columbia, because every election, you know, the coastal communities and the cities vote left and everybody else votes right. And it really like it's always that, and it goes back and forth who gets in. But yeah, even the left party is not going to unemploy 3/4 of the province, right? So you can't like, it's weird. It does kind of feel like, and then you got the question like, okay, so if you did have these like drastic environmental reforms, what would stop the next government in 4 years from rolling it all back? So in a sense, it does feel like, to deal with the climate crisis, like, does it require like authoritarian policies that like are locked in, like regardless of the change of government, regardless of public support? Like, is that what it takes? Because we don't seem to be achieving it through like these democratic mechanisms, right?
Democratic.
I think to kind of take oh, excuse me, I'll get out of the way here.
Oh no, go ahead.
Just to kind of take like a Studebaker and this guy William Robinson as well view of it, is like, I feel like also the point of this book is that even a perfect revolution, authoritarian or democratic, cannot solve the problem of global capital flows. So it's like, you nationally, the solution will not be national. It cannot be national. And right now, you know, the UN is, you know, not a governing body, certainly. So we're kind of in this situation where you've got capital, which can live globally, and everybody else who's stuck nationally. And so we're sort of in this position, and I'd be curious what people think about that.
Reminds me of a lot of the stuff that Yanis Varoufakis talks about in The Eye of the Storm. The fact that it became this situation where Greece was effectively at the whims of global capital, or at least you might call it Eurozone capital. And he effectively boiled it down to the international, you know, banking reforms that happened. I guess it would have been after World War II, when a lot of this ability to move the assets that would back all of these, you know, large multinational corporations more easily back and forth between economies. You get that flight, you get that reconstruction of the mechanisms, and then you turn those mechanisms on something that has no mechanisms to turn on you. You get this one-way sort of unilateral input system for these corporations. But again, like, it's lo and behold, that's the next paragraph. It's going to talk about localism, and it's the intuition that I had. So I'm sure Ben has plenty of ideas to do to dissuade people from, including myself. So I'm excited to see where he goes with it.
I totally lost track of who's up next for authoritarian reforms.
Should be Luke.
Is it Nance? Oh, is it Luke? Okay.
I think it's Luke, yeah.
Could be. I'll start.
Cool.
Fear of authoritarian reforms makes gridlock worse, encouraging localism. In the chronic crisis, we cannot abandon democracy, but we cannot accept it in its current form. We therefore must continue trying to save it with procedural reforms. But our reforms are never enough to address the root causes of the resentment that drives the crisis. To make things worse, we don't agree on what reforms are needed. Our disagreements are so intense that we often think other people's reforms are authoritarian. When hope fails to induce us to participate in politics, the fear of authoritarianism prevails. Fear of the right causes the left to join forces with the center to protect the status quo, and fear of the left causes the right to join forces with the center to do the same. Gradually, cooperation becomes impossible. Those who cooperate with the other side are thought to be collaborating with authoritarianism. They are denounced as useful idiots, fellow travelers, or worse. The whole political system locks up, and as it locks up, reformers grow more desperate to find a way to get the system to be more dynamic. Faced with an increasingly dysfunctional, heavily gridlocked federal government, reformers increasingly try to work around the federal system. They try to find local solutions to problems. There are both left and right-wing versions of this move. On the left, there are those who hope to build power by increasing the autonomy of US cities, or more radically, through the founding of communes. On the right, there are those who wish to increase the autonomy of state governments, or more radically, those who seek to live off the grid, outside of their government's influence. These movements might be described as anarchist or libertarian. I think those were 4 already, but I can continue.
I mean, if you want, those are short ones. If you want to keep going.
Yeah. But our economic problems are irreducibly global in scope. Individual US cities and states cannot change the structural incentives that drive jobs and investment from place to place. They don't control US trade policy. They cannot negotiate with foreign governments to set minimum standards. It is not easy for them to go their own way on taxes, wages, or regulations. When the federal government cedes power to cities, states, corporations, and individuals, it does nothing to address the real causes of resentment. Instead, the federal government weakens its own power to change the system, while, as Streeck puts it, fobbing off voters by giving the cities and states trivial, meaningless power. When the federal government cedes grounds to the cities and states, it does not strengthen them in any meaningful way. It simply allows them to get into a bidding war with each other over scarce jobs and scarce tax revenue. Oligarchs and corporations therefore have strong interest in encouraging both left anarchist and right libertarian movements. The more these movements succeed, the harder it is for the federal government to recover any semblance of the dynamism it once possessed. The American federal government created the global economic system. It wrote the rules. It is perhaps the only government in the world with anything like enough power to change the rules. Even its power may not be enough anymore. If American reformers grow frustrated with the federal government and try to tackle global problems with local institutions, they are sure to fail. But maybe our reformers don't need to solve economic problems if they can produce a new consensus on what democracy means. Can the chronic crisis end? In the second half of this book, we will look at 3 different ways the crisis could end. 1. Procedural reforms could fail to change the global economic system, but nonetheless succeed in restoring consensus about the meaning of democracy. 2. Failed efforts both to change the global economic system and restore consensus could produce a democracy built around despair. 3. This book could be wrong, and there could still be some way to use our existing democratic procedures to address resentment directly. These 3 ways of ending the crisis are the focal points of chapters 4, 5, and 6, respectively.
Fuck yeah. Good job, everybody.
Yay.
Thank you.
We did it.
Yeah, we just have to keep reading on to see whatever proclamations Benjamin is making, and also the follow-up book to this. I think says more about his ideas about the future. If you guys are wondering where do we go from here, or where must we go from here? Yeah. Good job, everyone. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Yeah, this was great. I think one thing that stuck out to me was that there are some points where like democracy is opposed to like oligarchy and corporatism or something, and that made me think like I don't think like a lot of people think we are living in some kind of oligarchy. Maybe they're a bit against corporatism, but I think the center is still really big. Maybe that's just my main takeaway, that all this talk about democratic crises, I'm not sure if it's just the way we look at things that biases us in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't think a lot of people feel like big corporations are opposed to democracy or something.
So are you kind of
They,
saying that
they can flourish because we have a democracy, right?
right?
And
So are
they got built up in a democracy. So how could they be like against democracy? I don't know.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, are you kind of asking if does the center even think that there is a crisis at all?
Yeah.
Which is a good question.
I think they do. And I think maybe they don't allow themselves to think it out loud or like in the front of their brain in bold letters. But I think there is a diffuse awareness that we're fucked. And I think that's why people are moving. Well, I mean, like when we dive deeper into identity categories and we dive deeper into this like affirmative, like, yay, you're special, you're awesome, special snowflake. Like that is a response to this like lack of a grounding. And for most people, I think for most contemporary, modern 21st century citizens, what grounds us cosmically is democracy, is this idea of progress and liberalism, and this like suritude that like everything is going to be okay. And there is a pathway for you to edification, to actualization, and to economic success. Put your mind to it. You could be anything. And I think it is true that that's eroding. And people are replacing it with commodities. People are replacing it with identity categories. People are replacing it with like extreme political movements. Like it is also true that like political extremism is becoming more and more popular. It's, the version of extremism is very superficial. It's also true that dozens of thousands of normies on Facebook are celebrating the murder of a CEO, and like that's not a trivial point. Like I think that says something, but it is also true that tomorrow everyone will forget about everything else because there will be a new commodity or there'll be a new identity category. There'll be a new Amazon movie about some fucking activist who did something, and it's such a heartrending story, and we can watch this and we can like perform I'm a good person. I believe that person was oppressed due to things they have no control over, and I watched the movie about it. Now I'm going to go back to work. There already is technology in place to deal with the fact that there is no more legitimacy. Like it is a total, like everything is captured. We are in fact fucked. And it is up to somebody to construct something else. And I don't know, is the first step is just getting people comfortable enough to admit that they see that we're fucked, because people do still cling desperately to democracy, free speech, or liberal rights, human rights, equality, whatever it is. And look, I believe in all these things, right? Like, I think people deserve dignity. But like, I also don't give a shit about the signifiers. Like, I don't fucking care if you want to talk about democracy. I don't like, yeah, I don't know. I don't.
Yeah, I think there's like a.
Go ahead, Kier.
Okay, that's what's kind of confusing, is it's like, does the fact that there seems to be like more and more sort of radical discourse and aesthetics online actually mirror a true political radicalism that's growing in the populace? Or is it a way for centrists that are actually quite happy, things are going pretty well for them, like they're not going to like risk whatever stability and security they have to blow off some steam and to make some jokes, right? Because it's like, if you actually want to go kill a CEO, the last thing you should do is be posting about it, right? Like it's like posting about it is almost the opposite of doing it, because you can't have both. So I think like that maybe is like, yeah, what I was like trying to get at with like my TUCon talk is like it's this real like dissonance, and it's like it's legitimately confusing. I don't think it's like, you know,
Mhm.
I don't think it makes like people dumb to like not see that dissonance or that divergence, because it took me a long time and I'm still not sure like what to make of it. But I do think that like it's almost like, yeah, you have to be you have to kind of be comfortable and like not scared of the state and not a threat to the state to like make your memes about like becoming an assassin, right? Like, because if the state's like already surveilling you and watching you and like waiting for you to fuck up so they can arrest you, like you're not posting that, right?
Hmm. It's very odd. I mean, we saw such a wonderful exposition of, like, I guess the dissonance. We can't really know what someone's thinking or even what a group of people are thinking, but I mean, like, Liz Cheney's name didn't just drop from the sky into everybody's mouth in the last couple of years. There's a reason why she's been in the news everywhere. The reason why Kamala thought she was going to be the ace in the hole. It's the reason why everybody was willing to put Dick Cheney next to, words that included at least neutral, if not decent qualifiers. That's not been done in a while. Um, so they whether or not, and I'll always remember the part of the concession speech from Joe Biden, which was it made no comments about any of the rhetoric or anything that he was worried about, and it seemed strange to me until I recognized that people like me aren't the audience; it's the captains of industry, and he wants them to know that the banks trust me, and you can trust me to keep it steady for you and the banks. I'm going to shift my weight from one side to the other, and the machines that we're all used to seeing the next day, and that represent our power to maintain the good things we already have, will remain stable. And that's after, you know Liz Cheney wasn't just some person out in the street screaming at a building can't get inside. She had a microphone. She was sitting aloft and doing these hearings. Like, it's they acknowledged that there was some sort of threat to the point where they were willing to publicly expend all of that effort, all of those resources, all of that money, all of those people, and all of those hours. Um, and then all of a sudden, the investment was actually in the peaceful transfer of power. What's the common thread between the two is, I suppose you might consider the idea that they thought it's what investors wanted. That would be my intuition, and I think that's ultimately what you're seeing now is that, like, people are less concerned because the investors see that they have a plan. They think they might be able to get a meeting with Donald Trump. They think they might be able to get a meeting with someone who's had a meeting with Donald Trump. Maybe it means that we're still going to be able to fund all those projects. Maybe our workers aren't going to hate us because we're going to have to lay them all off. Maybe we don't have to find a new CEO. Maybe we can keep finding workers that are cheaper than the ones we're currently paying by, taking advantage of the collapse of birth rates, and finding easier ways to legitimize bringing in workforces in ways we haven't done before. It's really, really, really odd to see the way that people use the same word. Obviously, Benjamin gets that. It's just fascinating.
Isn't it interesting? I'm thinking back to what Luke said too, that like the I think the centrists are aware that there's a crisis, but the way that they conceive of the crisis is very different from the way you, Mike, just conceived of the crisis. Like, the way some of my older family members sitting there watching the news are thinking, conceiving about the crisis is between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party and the threat of Donald Trump's tyranny. Like, this is one way of conceiving of a crisis, but like it sounds like another way of conceiving of the crisis, like, is what, like, Mike, you were talking about the investors have, I mean, this is, I'm interpolating what you're saying a little, but the investors have captured the state, you know what I mean? And so that when politicians are going on the news talking in the media, they're not talking to the people, they're talking to the investors, or they're talking to you know. So it's like, but those are two totally different ways of conceiving of a crisis. One is that we're in a crisis
Absolutely.
because we live in an oligarchy. The other is we're in a crisis because, oh no, democracy and Trump might be a threat to democracy. That, and to me, I see that as just like a epiphenomenon of some way deeper problem of what's going on.
100%.
But
100%.
I think the centrists know that there's a crisis, but we don't even agree what the hell the crisis is from person to person.
And isn't that just a reflection of the symbol of democracy itself? You know, in two different forms of crisis, about the same axis of the symbol of democracy, of the,
Mm-hmm.
you know, which robes and hats should the Church of Democracy wear today? Oh well, it's not this particular season, so why are they wearing that? There we go. We've transgressed. We're not doing it correctly. It's you're absolutely right, Sean. You're absolutely right. There's two different ways to describe it, and you almost
Probably a
have
lot more than
these
two, also.
vanishing. It's almost like we've had a vanishing mediator in the Zizekian sense, because the crisis is gone, in some way.
Yeah, I just finished Leah Yippie's memoir called Free, and her childhood. Well, she lives in Albania until she eventually leaves, but that's where she grows up, and it's under Uncle Enver, who I heard someone else say is like the most Stalinist leader who wasn't Stalin. And so that's like her childhood, but then somewhere in her teenage years is the uprising and the revolt. And, you know, they have an election and it gets complicated from there. But the point is that, like, the crazy part is, like, you know, for so long, it's like things are treated as if they have always been socialist. They always will be socialist. Well, until we get to communism, but there's like this ahistoricity going on, and there's also this conception of freedom that's like very like true for the people that are living in it, right? That they have this freedom that like the imperialists and the capitalists do not. And like they're not totally delusional about that. But then when the freedom shifts, like the most fascinating part is like once like the floodgates open, like the European Union and like global neoliberal process that occurs leaves absolutely no room for the people of Albania to have any input, any meaningful input whatsoever about what their new system will look like. So it's like just this unbelievable like double disillusionment almost for her, where it's like, you know, there is this like revolutionary moment after people start to like question the socialist system, but so quickly, like, you know, they all just become like fodder for this like process that, you know, is called freedom too, you know. So, and the funny thing is, like, eventually she moves to London, and the friends she meet who are socialists who have never lived in a socialist country refuse to call anything that she's ever experienced socialist, right? They say that's not socialism to every single thing that she has to say about her childhood, the government, whatever. None of it is socialist according to these people who've never experienced it. And that was like, I don't know, that kind of haunts me, right? And I feel like maybe there's a parallel with like living under like liberalism or living under democracy, where it's like, no,
Absolutely.
it's never what we have. It's always like, it's always something else. But then what do we call what we have, right? Like, yeah.
Absolutely. It caught mired in definition wars rather than, like, you know, outcomes and all that jazz. And I think even, you know, the book makes an excellent case that, like, even if we were to turn to outcomes right now, what mechanisms would we even have?
We do still have to start with words, though, don't we? Like, Like I had this impulse for a while to just be like, stop fucking talking, just do stuff. You know what I mean? But like, how can we do have to start with words, because just doing stuff, that's what like the Maoists called blind actionism, you know, which is something I like
Right.
from there. Is like just doing stuff is like, but so we do have to start with words. We just have to find a very
I think
different way of
so.
approaching shit. But I want to know
Absolutely.
what Nancy's gonna say, because he's waving his fingers.
No.
So
Yeah.
tell-
First of all,
Harry.
the propaganda of the deed. Johann Most. He was a cool anarchist,
Classic.
train robber guy, and he wrote some songs. And anarchism is fun and cool, but no, it's actually we have to start with words, but we have to start with like shared grounds. We have to start with like I said shart. We have to start. We have to start with mutually intelligible words. We are languaged beings. We
Yeah, we need
exist in the world of words. But here in the future, yeah, we are.
Sorry,
Here-
aren't we at like a Tower of Babel
Yeah.
moment where no one can agree on? Yeah.
Yeah, dude, like postmodernity, like the postmoderns, like it's not that we're saying like, oh, nothing is real, nothing matters. We're criticizing the system that we live in that makes it so nothing is real and nothing matters anymore. We are in the Tower of Babel. We are in this fractured kaleidoscope of like meaningless fucking, it's a cacophony of unintelligible screams of fucking horror and terror and despair. Like that is the world we live in. And we have to construct a framework for mutual intelligibility and mutual recognition as well. That is the task. That is the task. So it's not radical praxis, and it's not the case that we're going to bring about utopia and heaven on earth through our actions here. Like, no, we're going to bring about mutual intelligibility. That's why socioanalysis matters. That's why alien anthropology. That's why going about creating shared grounds and shared meaning and blah, blah, blah. And we know these things already. So,
But
Well, it's good for the folks that may not have heard it before.
I had
I
a
immediately-
question. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. No,
No,
I
go ahead,
immediately
please.
think like the fact that we can't agree on what democracy means. Like, can we just short circuit it into saying democracy is the thing where we can find like agreeable meaning of, like, maybe what Adorno said about society or something. Like, society is what society can decide on what it is. Or is this too easy? And now I'm also thinking like maybe democracy never was really clear. Even when we have like a full democracy, like people still probably disagreed about what democracy meant, but this disagreement wasn't just that much of a problem. Like, we can go just about our days with like, oh yeah, that cuckoo, or that how do you say it, like that one thinks like this is democracy and I think this is democracy, but in the end we still kind of agree or something. And now there's like such a suspicion with people like saying the word democracy, and everybody's like, no, but that's not what democracy means. And
I think it's
I think that's the difference between the full and the minimal that Studebaker talked about. Go ahead, Nils, or whoever that was.
I liked one of Sean's presentations to UConn where he's talking about like the demos and blah blah blah. What are we doing? And I think it's also a point worth bringing up that like maybe we don't want a kind of perfect democracy. Like I think if you look at an ideal social unit or even an idealized social unit, there is authority and there is repression and there are limits. And I think that's also important to include in this conversation. Like when we talk about, our future utopia, however we envision it, fully automated luxury gay space communism all the way, but also like there will always be chores to do. There will always be dishes to wash. There will always be a need for cops. And I think a pluralism is necessary. So maybe we have to allow for people who don't want democracy, for people who just want to go be an instrument to go do that. But then that raises questions as well. And how do we protect people who can't protect themselves and this and that?
Oh,
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite thinks on, or go ahead, Sean. I got this. I can follow you after.
okay, I just wanted to say, like, I think that when we are thinking about proposing definitions so we can have a shared sense of meaning on things, I think what we need to do is we need political definitions, and by that I specifically mean future-oriented definitions that are unto specific goals that we want to see realized. And so, like, I'll just leave you with my definition for now is of democracy is that's a systematic rule of governance whereby the law. Sorry, it's a system of governance whereby the law systematically conforms to the rational will of the majority of the population. That's what I think democracy is in a future-oriented way. You know what I mean? I'm not
Nope.
trying to fit everything that has ever been called democracy into it. I don't give a fuck if it leaves some things out. I don't care, right? and also, I think like, but what Nance said about like, you were kind of saying about prohibition, about like law. It's a system of law. There's gonna be a no in democracy, and it needs to have a no. There always needs to be a no, and this is why I'm not an anti-statist. This is why I believe that a state will always be necessary, because we need prohibition, and we need, and furthermore, we need to be able to rule ourselves, or we will be ruled. Anyone who cannot rule themselves is asking to become ruled by somebody else. So anyway.
Responsibility, right? We know the other side of rights is responsibilities. That doesn't make me
Exactly.
reactionary to say that.
No, there's a thinker that that I have read, and I haven't read a lot of his stuff, but I was fascinated to hear about it because it was on the sort of side of political philosophy that I hadn't really explored, because it's very I guess you might call it classic conservatism, believe it or not. But there's a writer named Wilmer Kendall. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. And he has this really interesting article. And again, I come from completely different priors than this guy, but he writes this passage about, and a commentary on, I think it was Plato's execution or Plato's trial in the Republic, or in the anyway. He was being tried, and I think this was before they decided that they were going to kill him. And there's a whole story about his response to this the body that was deciding whether or not to kill him, and they effectively gave him the right to flee. And what he had said was, to the effect of, "This place, I owe everything I am to this place. It's only right that I don't flee its decision to mutate, or to mute me, to say, to take my existence away. I owe my existence to it." But he did have the right to flee. He could never come back. But they were ready to let him walk away if he wanted to disavow everything that made him who he was, when it had come to the conclusion that he was an imminent threat and needed to be extinguished. A really fascinating look at that sort of, what does pluralism really mean, and how far can pluralism go? Like, what's the limit? What's the point where you're like, you can go anywhere but you can't stay here? Like, that's a pluralism too, but it's a very what would you call it? Severe one, a very stark one. It's building the wall, really. Anyway, fascinating.
Hannah Arendt talks about that. That was Socrates. Hannah Arendt talks about that as well in Responsibility and Judgment.
Oh,
Where
thank you.
Socrates, he's like, I owe it to the polis. I owe it to you people. I also owe it to myself to kind of take the judgment that's been handed down. Else I wouldn't be able to live with myself. That's the really cool part about Responsibility and Judgment, where Hannah Arendt is like, you can ground morals in how can you live with yourself. It's a good book. You should read it. What were you going to say, Sean?
Oh, I like that. I'm writing down the title of that because there's so many Hannah Arendt books. I'm like,
Yeah, dude.
I'm not gonna read all of them. So like, which ones should I read? No, I was just gonna say I just read this. It's mirrored, so you probably can't see what the title is. It's also overexposed, but it's called The Shadow of Socrates. It's by Matt Gatton. I just read it. I'm trying to get Benjamin to read it because I want to see what he thinks about it, having a lot more knowledge about the era. But it was fascinating to me. It was a great because he reproduces huge chunks of primary source literature in it, and so he really like shows you instead of tells you what his argument is. But it's a great look at the. I thought it was a fantastic look at the trial of Socrates and in a democratic context. So it was interesting. It's for further reading.
Can y'all drop those book names in the chat?
Oh, that's a good idea.
It's a good idea.
You don't have to.
Just in case we want to pick those up, because yeah,
Yeah.
many ways to come at it. And if Hannah's wrote about it, I should bloody well read it.
Yeah.
I kind of forgot that there was a chat.
Yeah, I don't know where it's at here on Discord.
Oh, I opened it. You got level 1 exegetical reading, the title of what the thing we're in. You click on the just to the right of it. Open chat.
Of course I knew that. I was testing you, dude.
Wait, why do I not have permission?
Oh no.
You do not have permission to send messages.
There's another channel. I think it's the organizing one. Maybe you could just drop it in the way is shut forum.
Oh yeah, let's do that.
Yeah,
It's weird that I don't have permission though.
We'll figure that out. So I'm gonna hit the bye YouTube button. Does anyone have any parting words or thoughts for the people out there in TV land?
Bye, TV land.
Bye YouTube.
Bye everybody.